Hi, and welcome to Why Intolerance and Extremism Happen and What We Can Do About All the Anger and Division. In this series, I'll explore some big questions. Why do some people spiral into extremism? Why does it feel like we're always on the brink of disaster? Why is there so much anger and division? And finally, what we can do about it. I'm Teri Kanefield. In this series, I will draw on research from political psychology, history, neuroscience, constitutional law, journalism, and more to understand what's happening and how to best respond. First, a story about one of my in-laws. In September of 2024, we went to Chile for the National Independence festivities and a reunion for my husband and his siblings. While we were there, I learned something that surprised me. One of my husband's relatives, she's 84 and one of the sweetest people I know, admired Augusto Pinochet. She was firm in her views. I was warned not to try to talk politics with her, so I didn't. But I talked to others who knew her opinions. I asked, does she know that Pinochet staged a military coup? Does she know he overthrew the legitimately elected president? Does she know he installed himself as a brutal dictator? The answer was yes, she knows all that. But she says he saved Chile from communism. Now, this is a woman who worked all her life as a baker. She never had much money. She's kind to everyone. I struggled to reconcile her economic status and her sweet disposition with her support for a brutal dictator. To make sense of it, I dug deeper into Chilean history. What I found were two competing narratives of the Pinochet story, each side emphasizing different facts. First, according to political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, before Pinochet's coup in 1973, Chileans were proud to have the most stable democracy in South America. This is from their book called How Democracies Die. But Stanford political scientist Robert Pakenham and historian William Radcliffe, writing for the Hoover Institution, call that a half-truth at best. Specifically, they say, the late strongman ruled harshly but left behind the most successful country in Latin America. So, what actually happened? In a nutshell, in 1970, Salvador Allende, co-founder of Chile's Socialist Party, was elected president of Chile. Chile at the time had extreme income inequality that Allende's party wanted to address. After he was inaugurated, he set to work restructuring Chilean society. To redistribute income, his government authorized large wage increases and froze prices. The government acquired significant privately owned mining and manufacturing assets and took control of large agricultural estates for use by farming cooperatives. While it's pretty much agreed among historians that Allende respected due process of law, some people argue that he went too far with executive degrees. Now, among other things, Allende's government took control of U.S.-owned copper companies in Chile. His government argued that excess profits constituted payments. Well, the Nixon administration was furious. Foreign investors lost confidence in Chile. The Chilean economy took a dive. A shortage of basic commodities created a black market. Sporadic violence from the far left continued under Allende, contributing to the polarization and anxiety. People were braced for trouble. Pakenham and Radcliffe say that Chile was, quote, well on the way to self-destruction by the time of Pinochet's military coup. Now, it seems to me both things can be true. It can be true that before Pinochet, Chile had the most stable democracy in South America. It can also be true that Allende's rapid changes destabilized the economy, fueling fear and igniting a right-wing backlash. Then, on September 11, 1973, with U.S. help, Pinochet staged a military coup. Tanks rolled into Santiago, fighter jets bombed the presidential palace, and Allende was overthrown. Pinochet then consolidated power. He dismantled Allende's reforms, installed himself as a dictator, and held on to power for nearly 20 years. During that time, roughly 28,000 people were arrested for opposing him, many were tortured, and more than 3,000 people were executed or disappeared. It seems to me, by all measures, this was brutal. His supporters justified the brutality by arguing that Pinochet responded to a crisis and did what was necessary. His defenders say he was saving the Constitution. I could find no credible sources, however, that claimed that Pinochet followed the law. He was, according to his defenders, using illegal means to save the Constitution. This is we have to break the rules to protect ourselves from danger argument. Pinochet held on to support and power until 1988 when he lost a plebiscite. 55% voted against extending his rule, but 44% still supported him. So you see, dictators often have real public support. They have defenders. In a 2015 interview, Chilean-American poet Marjorie Agosin said, "I think Pinochet has been proven to be an evil dictator in the eyes of most people in the world, and most people see Allende as a dreamer and even a visionary." Well, I had always assumed this was true, but of course, most people does not mean everyone. Okay, so was Pinochet evil? Philosophers have long pondered the meaning and existence of evil. Medieval philosophers, steeped in the Christian religion, struggled to reconcile the idea of an all-powerful God with the existence of evil. If God is good and all-powerful, why did he create and allow evil? There is also discussion among philosophers about whether we should even talk about evil. Some claim that evil is nothing more than a word for what we don't understand. Others argue that evil is too often just a slur against enemies. I suggest that we use the word cruel instead of evil because cruel doesn't carry the connotation of a grand moral judgment. It has fewer theological implications. It doesn't conjure the idea of supernatural or satanic forces. It's also easier to establish. Here is the Oxford American Dictionary definition of cruelty. Behavior or actions that deliberately cause pain or distress to people or animals done either by intention, indifference, or wanton neglect. Evil requires a particular state of mind, while cruelty doesn't. A small child who tortures an animal is being cruel. Whether the child is evil is a different question, and most likely the answer is no. We still need to do some hair splitting because a doctor setting a broken bone might deliberately inflict pain, but he's obviously not being cruel. On the other hand, criminal punishment is always cruel, but whether it's necessary can be argued. If you ask, was Pinochet's cruelty justified? Some people will argue yes, and some people will argue no. So I guess you could say that evil means unjustified cruelty, which leaves open an argument about whether the cruelty was justified. By the way, I put a link in the notes to a transcript of this talk. The transcript has more links if you want to read more and think more about these issues. Okay, so since World War II, there has been a renewed interest in the concept of evil as people have struggled to understand genocides, terrorist acts, mass killings. One such person was Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher and political theorist. She was arrested by the Nazis in 1933 for anti-Nazi activities, and shortly afterwards, she escaped to France. When the Nazis seized France, they were after her again, so she fled to the United States. In 1961, the New Yorker magazine sent her to Jerusalem to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was a key architect of the Holocaust and organizer of the death camps. Eichmann argued at his trial that he had been simply following orders. Arendt was struck by his complete moral indifference and his belief that all rules, no matter what those rules are, must be obeyed. For Arendt, he represented something more terrifying than an embodiment of Satan or supernatural evil forces. He represented what she called the banality of evil, which is ordinary people acting from ordinary impulses like a desire for a promotion or a belief that all rules must be obeyed no matter what. People who nonetheless participate in actions that bring about mass death. In the book that resulted from her reporting at the trial, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, she rejected the idea that evil is done by people who are depraved or possessed by demonic forces. She argued instead that evil is committed by people who just don't think critically or who don't consider the moral implications of their actions. Plato argued that democracy's flaw is that too few people can think deeply about the complex issues inherent in politics. The same flaw obviously applies to other forms of government. Eichmann was not part of a democracy. A German friend once told me this story. In 1990, in the early 1990s, he was traveling in the former Soviet Union. Because so many people were still alive who remembered the Nazi invasion, he was accustomed to people feeling uncomfortable with him. Then, one day, someone took him aside and whispered, "I admire what Hitler tried to do." My friend was shocked. This brings us to the question, how do these dictators secure and retain so much public support? And that brings me to demagogues. The ancient Greeks gave us the word democracy. Demos means people and krasi means to rule. The ancient Greeks also gave us the word demagogue, which literally means a leader of the people, but has come to mean a person, especially a political leader, who seeks support by appealing to popular desires and prejudices rather than by using rational argument. Plato believed that people were too susceptible to the siren call of a demagogue for democracy to be stable. Dictators and would-be dictators, by the way, are a subgroup of demagogues. So demagogues either take advantage of existing chaos or they invent a problem and then offer a solution that, first, benefits them, and second, sets them up for the role of savior. Professor Harold Hill in The Music Man demonstrates. Professor Harold Hill tells the citizens of River City this: "Friend, either you are closing your eyes to a situation you do not wish to acknowledge, or you are not aware of the caliber of disaster indicated by the presence of a pool table in your community. Well, you got trouble, my friend." Now, in the notes, I put a link to a YouTube performance of this song. You can pause right now and go listen or listen to it at the end of the podcast. If you've never heard it, it's a perfect example of a demagogue in action. Professor Harold Hill, well, spoiler, he's not really a professor, then offers the solution: buy what he is selling. Harold Hill follows the classic formula. Frightened people make bad decisions, so scare them. Arouse their fears. When people are frightened enough, they're more likely to follow a demagogue. Elie Merritt, a political historian at Vanderbilt University, puts the matter more simply. He says, demagogues destroy democracies. He calls this the golden rule of democracies. It's the golden rule because democracy, by its very nature, allows for the rise of demagogues. A demagogue, to come to power, requires freedom of speech. At the same time, democracy requires freedom of speech to thrive. People need to be free to critique their elected leaders as part of the process of deciding which leaders they want next. If you restrict speech so far that a demagogue cannot possibly arise, you will also remove the same freedom that allows democracy to thrive. See the problem? You can't silence ideas in a democracy, and that includes anti-democratic ideas. The only remedy is to teach the public to reject demagogues, which means enough people have to understand the dangers to keep a majority from falling under their spell. This brings me to the authoritarian personality. One question political psychologists ask is this: what makes certain people susceptible to the appeal of a demagogue? The second question is there anything we can do to blunt the power and appeal of a demagogue while maintaining democratic institutions? As with any interesting set of questions, it wasn't long before scientists sought the answers. The first researchers to investigate the question, what about human beings allowed for such atrocities as the Nazi death camps, was a team at the University of California at Berkeley. The team member who became most widely known, Theodor Adorno, was a German sociologist and Marxist who fled Germany in 1934 when the Nazis targeted left-leaning scholars. Because of his background and because the Nazi atrocities were well known, it's no surprise that the team focused on what we might call right-wing authoritarianism. Their work, therefore, had that bias. Before we go on, a quick word about right-wing and left-wing. These labels are convenient shorthands, but the labels are problematic. People shift their positions depending on the issue. Political movements attract different kinds of people for different reasons. The term left and right can mean different things in different countries and can carry different connotations. But labels are a useful shorthand if we keep their limits in mind. Okay, back to the authoritarian personality. This is the personality that's susceptible to a demagogue. The term authoritarian personality comes from the title of the book that the team published in 1950. The authoritarian personality describes the people who fall in line behind an authoritarian leader. The authors use the term fascist for fascist leader because they were focused on authoritarianism on the right side of the political spectrum. It seems to me the term demagogues is broader and more accurate. To summarize, the authors concluded that people with this disposition are rigid thinkers who have difficulty with nuance. They have an intolerance of ambiguity. All of this leads up to an inability to process complex issues. Now, doesn't this sound the way Hannah Arendt described Adolf Eichmann? I suggest that this team were true innovators. True innovators are often met with harsh criticism. This is partly because new ideas are unsettling, and partly because those who are first cannot have perfected their research methods. Those who are first often don't have the perspective to see their own biases. The authors of the authoritarian personality were innovators. Their ideas were unsettling. Their biases, focused only on extremists on the right side of the political spectrum, were evident. But their book and the answers it suggested spawned an entire field of study that continued to the present. The phrase, the authoritarian personality, is widely used to describe a particular kind of person. Political psychologist and behavioral economist Karen Stenner built on earlier research to develop a theory explaining how and why authoritarian movements arise. In doing so, she identifies the root causes of intolerance. Now, intolerance can take multiple forms. It can mean racism. It can also show up as, say, language policing, insisting that everyone only use the words that the language police deem acceptable. This can be annoying or can feel like a personal attack. Stenner's research shows that the authoritarian personality exists on both sides of the political spectrum. A recent study she conducted found that roughly 39% of Americans identifying as Republicans are highly authoritarian, compared with about 22% of people who identify as Democrats. Her research led her to conclude that there are two critical determinants of authoritarianism. The first is the personality trait known as closed-mindedness. This is a tendency to avoid new experiences, ideas, or perspectives. The second determinant is best described as cognitive incapacity. These people are, to use her phrase, simple-minded avoiders of complexity. Stenner tells us that people with authoritarian predisposition, people who are susceptible to a demagogue, favor oneness and sameness. They want to minimize differences. This can include racial, religious, and political differences. Some authoritarians want everyone to hold the same beliefs. Others want all people to be of the same religion. One way or another, authoritarians want everyone to fall in line. To achieve this, they insist on boundaries, and they look for institutions and authority figures that will secure those boundaries. Because people predisposed to authoritarianism occurs naturally in about a third of the population, Stenner refers to being authoritarian as another way to be human. Now, on the other end of the spectrum are those who are non-authoritarian. These are people who value differences. They are accepting of people who are not like them. They're comfortable with diversity, which is a form of complexity. They don't expect everyone to think like them or be like them. There is a gradation, of course. Most people fall somewhere along the spectrum between one end, highly authoritarian, and the other end, no authoritarian tendencies. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for joining me. I'll pick up next time with ideological thinking and existence pain.